Financial media is something that we all have to live with, and they do really good work most of the time. Have you given some consideration to the role of the financial media, how they filter the news, what they let you see, what they stress, and what they have to think about on their side as they decide what will make it into print and not? That's what we talk about this week. Stick around. This is Make Better Wealth Decisions, a podcast about financial blind spots, decision making, and how the reality of higher rates, global tensions, and tariff instability impact your investments. I'm your host, John DeGuy, a portfolio manager with Design Securities in Toronto. This week, we're speaking with Kevin Press. He is the editorial director of advisor.ca and investment executive. His financial services career goes back to 1997. Oh boy, almost actually not quite as long as me. He's worked as a journalist, as a marketer, and as a communications professional. Kevin, welcome.
Hey, John. Good to be with you.
I've done some interviews in the past with one of your colleagues, Newcomb. Newcomb is the umbrella company that runs both Investment Executive and Advisor.ca. And one of the things that we talk about is the consumer media versus the trade media and articles that are written for the industry, such as your publications, as compared to a national newspaper or a local newspaper. And I'm wondering if I could ask you to begin by perhaps going over the nuances of the mandates of those two sort of streams of financial journalism.
Yeah, there's a distinction for sure. Trade media, sometimes referred to as business to business media, has a very specific role, and I think a particularly important one in the context of the financial industry. Our audience is financial advisors. So, where our folks over at the Globe and Mail, for example, or Toronto Star would be focused on providing information and news to consumers across the country. Our focus are the informational needs of financial advisors, and we work hard to make sure that we're providing them not just the news of the day, but the perspective that they need in order to best serve their clients. What's interesting about both Investment Executive and Advisor.ca is that we go a step further. We believe very firmly that central to our role, in addition to informing advisors, is to play a consumer advocacy role, an investor advocacy role. But we take that to heart and it influences what we do on both platforms. There is a distinction between the two, as you say. Advisor.ca is a Canadian news platform that also focuses on practice management. So that's information on how to grow your business, how to serve your clients, how to market your business. A lot of case studies, stories about real clients and real experiences. Investment Executive is both a Canadian and an international news platform where we do more on the regulatory front from a global perspective and various kinds of industry news. They keep us busy, both of them.
It's interesting because I could argue that the regular press that goes out to the general public covers much of the same material, not certainly the news, the regulatory developments, the consumer advocacy, not so much the case studies and how to grow your practice. Are there other more specific nuance differences in terms of how the stories might be written or the angle that you might take with regard to the advocacy, with regard to these are the new regulations that are coming down the pike, and the role of both platforms with regard to those client facing mandates as compared to the mandates of serving advisors?
Sure. Yeah. There's a couple of dimensions to this. The first one I'd point to is there's clearly a level of sophistication among our readers that allows us to dig a little deeper, look at some of the more nuanced aspects of stories. I think that we can cover certainly the wealth management business. And on the insurance side, we can cover product information at greater depth than we would if we were writing for a purely consumer audience. Now, that's not to say that a sophisticated investor isn't going to get value out of either of our platforms. The truth is, they do, and they visit us often. We know that to be the case. The other thing, though, which I think is important to understand, is that we come at the stories from the perspective again as how do we help our readers serve their clients? So, a really perfect example of this would be, of course, all of the talk about trade that we've been covering quite extensively since even before Trump was elected. It was clear from the campaign that he was headed in a direction that would have a direct impact on Canada. And so when we write stories about that topic and when we decide which stories to assign on that topic, we're thinking about what does the advisor need to be thinking about? What is the advisor likely to hear from their client in the way of questions? How to answer those questions? And if you look back at what we've done with that topic over now several months, it's all been about preparing the client to have what are probably some of the most difficult conversations they've had to have over the course of their careers, in part because of the potential impact of these things, but just simply the fact that the thing seems to change on a day to day basis, sometimes multiple times during a day. And that's the toughest thing for an advisor, right? Is to talk to a client about an area that's unclear, that nobody really knows how it's going to play out. So we see an opportunity for both advisor.ca and an investment executive to help them through that, share what others are thinking, what others are forecasting from a variety of perspectives.
Well, let's talk about the news in 2025 because there's a lot going on, as you quite properly pointed out. I'm wondering if you could perhaps look a little bit into your crystal ball, talk a little bit about the stories that you think are dominating what's being written now in the spring, but perhaps offer some thoughts to what might be written about a little more often as we go on down the road as the year progresses. What do you see as being the main themes that are developing in 2025?
Trade obviously is at the top of most everyone's list of things to watch this year, and we're going to continue to cover that. You know, my philosophy as a journalist and as an editor is that a really successful trade platform is one that treats the subject matter the same way that a news magazine does. So I like to think of us as the McLeans of the financial advice business or the wealth management business. I think if you take that perspective on the topic, on the subject matter, you are paying the right kind of attention to the macro environment as opposed to the sort of nitty gritty of what's happening in the industry. That's not to suggest that nitty gritty isn't important. It's absolutely fundamental to how we coverage this space. But it's, again, very important, I think, that our readers have that greater sense of context of what's going on. Clearly, trade is going to be a big part of that. When I talk to portfolio managers and risk managers and the various folks that like to talk to us about these things, it's clear what's happening on the tariff front and the trade negotiations front. We're only at the very front end of this thing, that this is surprisingly bipartisan in nature, which is to say that the Democrats are very much on the same page as the Republicans when it comes to the reshoring of manufacturing into the US. Clearly, they're going to differ on tactics. I think you'd see the Democrats probably more likely to write trade deals rather than implement tariffs, but this isn't going away. And the potential for inflation, perhaps even stagflation, I think is going to be a very important story for us this year. Another key theme is in the area of mergers and acquisition activity. So we're hearing this from multiple industry folks that the pent up demand that developed as interest rates rose post COVID, the access to capital that firms needed in order to do deals, it was just prohibitively expensive. But we know, particularly in the wealth management business, although it's true on the insurance side as well, that scale is everything. And so there's always going to be opportunities sought out to grow businesses. So you've got this sort of pent up demand. Interest rates haven't come down fully, of course, but they're down to a more manageable state. Capital is more accessible. So we expect to see a lot of that happening, both at the top end of the business, where you'll see mid to large size firms making purchases. I think the story that we saw with CI Financial is very interesting. That there you have a a Canadian based money manager with large exposure to the US market and the added dimension of international private equity firm stepping in to take them private. Fascinating to watch that sort of thing as it, we think, continues. There's also, of course, a lot of folks at the lower end, the small end of the industry. We think you'll see a lot of businesses rolled up as advisors age and start to think about succession planning. We think this year you're going to see a lot of kind of activity as well. That's the second one. M&A activity, I think, is going to be fascinating. Crypto is one that I think we can do more on, but not just in terms of the bad actors, right? I think that crypto is becoming increasingly discussed as a potential inflation hedge. I don't buy that myself. I think it's far too volatile to serve as an inflation hedge. But that conversation is going on. So understanding crypto, understanding what is going to happen as a result of some of the actions going on in Washington, which further legitimizes the asset class. I think that the regulatory front is going to need to be continued. We're going to need to continue to watch that. I think that's obviously very important. Crypto, I think, is going to be a fascinating story for this year.
So that's a
Interested in
really
that?
good summary of maybe the top three, and I'm sure you'll have others. I couldn't help but notice that there are a couple of themes that were running through that. So you were talking about whether or not crypto works as an inflation hedge, but then also you were talking in the context of trade, how we might be moving into a world of stagflation.
Yeah.
And so I thought I should ask you maybe a little bit about inflation with regard to the role that your publications play with regard to the case studies and the nimbleness of advisors as circumstances evolve. And is there maybe some thought that might be given in the next little while to perhaps a case study of what was done in the 1970s with the stagflation that we had then and similarities, differences, what could have been done then, what was tried, what worked, what didn't, and what could we be doing in the future? Because I, for one, am of the opinion that stagflation is pretty much already upon us and that the tariffs will both be inflationary and will cause economic growth to stagnate and perhaps even go into reverse. And no one is really talking about it much. Thank you for bringing it up, but I think stagflation is already upon us, and I wonder if we might be hearing more about that concept in the coming months and the rest of the year.
You certainly will hear about it from us. And I do think you're right that it's going to be a very important story this year. I'm not fully there in terms of saying it's upon us, although I'm ready to be proven wrong about that. I think the indications are very worrisome. So back to my point about the reshoring of manufacturing in the US. If that's happening, and if that's going to continue to happen, no matter the balance of power in Washington, you're going to see an inflationary push as a result of that. But of course, this is a time when, if you're a central banker, I don't know how you chart a path forward. You're going to have a slowdown in economic activity as a result of the trade actions being taken at the same time that they drive inflation. So you are going to have this situation with opposing forces where you've got an, in, an inclination to raise rates to tamp down inflation, but at the same time cut rates in order to promote growth. That's a virtually impossible place to be in as a central banker. And I think that contributes to the kind of stagflationary environment that John, you and others are talking about. I think it's a very important question. And one too, where again, our role is to help advisors recognize it, understand it, and find ways to talk about it. Because as you say, it's been decades since we dealt with anything like this, almost 50 years. There aren't an awful lot of folks out there who can speak to a stagflationary environment with real knowledge of how these things come upon us and how to get out of them. We're headed into a very challenging period, I think.
And I think that also brings up the related elephant in the room, and that is the political overlay, some coming from south of the border, we have to try to manage our portfolios, and central bankers have to do what they can, and ministers of finance and prime ministers have to do what they can on the fiscal side to manage the economy as best they can. But the fact of the matter is, we're dealing with more uncertainty and more chaos than perhaps any time in my lifetime. And it would be difficult to cover the economic aspect of what's going on without at least more than touching on wading into a political environment which is very polarized and very difficult to discuss in meaningful terms. So perhaps you could talk about how your publications try to separate the wheat from the chaff to talk about the facts, the economic circumstances, without getting involved in the partisan attacks and the rhetoric and the saber rattling.
Yeah. Probably more difficult than I've ever experienced in my career. We talk about it literally every day. Is this story purely political, or is there some aspect of this which impacts economic policy making, which touches on how advisors provide direction to their clients? What kinds of questions are they likely to get? It's a fairly straightforward question. Is this a purely political story? But when the politics touches so consistently on economics and economic policy, it's difficult, frankly, not to get caught up in, as you say, the day to day nuances of the politics of the thing. We're trying hard not to go down that path. I think we've done a good job so far in managing that. But listen, I'm going to err on the side of inclusion. I think it's vitally important that we recognize that what's happening in Ottawa, in Washington, and other capitals around the world is going to impact the Canadian economy and global markets for years to come. This is genuinely transformative, and it's incumbent upon us to help our readers understand that. Day to day, keeps shifting. And we keep coming back to this question of do we take Trump literally? Do we take him seriously? I wrote a piece back in the fall about we need to frankly believe that Trump is telling the truth. I think he comes into office this time around far more organized, with a far more loyal team of advisors who are prepared what economic policy serves America best and the impacts of that on Canada. I think that's at play, and I think we need to take it both seriously and literally.
So, moving from large P politics to small p politics, when we talk about regulatory reform, there is lobbying being done at the firm level and at the advisory level. And one of the things that I know that is dear to both of us, because you were kind enough to run a piece that I wrote about a month or so ago about financial advisor independence. That's something that touches on what you mentioned a moment ago, the consumer perspective. And I'm wondering if you could weigh in, and I have to be very careful because I don't want you to get into trouble. And I'm not trying to get you into trouble. The industry says things like, well, we're independent that just are just outrageously inconsistent with what a dictionary would say is the way the word independent would be defined. And yet they get away with it. And I would say there are people like me that are trying to call them out, but I'm just one guy. To what extent can the press call out regulators and firms that speak to regulators, because regulators are largely just parroting what the firms tell them with regard to, well, no, that's bullshit. That's just not the way independence works. Where would you draw that line?
Yeah. Well, I loved your piece, John. In fact, it inspired an editorial in our February print edition of Investment Executive. Look, I come from a very simple place on this. My career has stretched across journalism. I've worked in the industry, number of years with Sun Life, RBC Insurance, and now back to journalism, which I had promised myself I would get to do toward the end of my career. I'm just so happy to be back. My view through all of that time has been how do we help Canadians understand money in a way that allows them to take care of themselves and their families for the long term? That's the guiding principle in everything I've ever done, whether it's financial literacy work, whether it's a customer experience program I led in the insurance industry, a variety of things, always coming back to how do we make this better for the customer? And on the question of independence, apply a very simple lens is what we talk about as industry participants the same as what the consumer's perception is? And I've got to say it's not. If you ask a consumer what it means to be an independent advisor, you're going to get a very simple answer. That's someone who makes decisions uninfluenced by any corporate structure, any product shelf considerations, anything at all other than the client's best interests. Now, I've been around long enough to know that kind of advisor is out there and he or she works in all kinds of corporate settings. And so for me, it's not actually about ownership structure so much as it is about process. And so there's a couple things we can do. Number one, as an industry, we should be talking about process a whole lot more with our customers. Transparency is a big part of the solution. But then I'd go a step further and I'd really challenge the industry to reconsider the use of the term. I'm not sure it adds a lot of value. I think consumers more and more take a very jaundiced view of the notion of independence in our industry and others. I don't think this is unique to financial services, although it's clearly a recurring theme in our business. As someone who has worked both as a journalist and as a marketer, I don't think claims of independence are all that effective in terms of winning a consumer's confidence. It's all about the execution. So my vote is we do away with the term and get on with serving clients the best possible way.
I like that. That's a good answer. I would heartily endorse that because the term has become so overused that it's basically useless. It's trite and it's the sort of thing that people use because they think that's what people want to hear. So people in the industry use it because they think the people they're speaking to want to hear it. But when they use it, what they say and what people hear and think they hear and what they think they understand are often very different things. I'd like to also talk to you to get your take on working with financial journalists. So, when you write a story, or when someone else in your shop writes a story, sometimes you interview an advisor and you're hoping to get the advisor's take on what's going on, or your advisor like me submits a piece. And sometimes you're in the on the national press, you're really trying to find ways to help the ordinary person in you're interviewing the man or woman on the street, so to speak. Maybe I should talk to you about, since you're working with the advisor community, what is it you're looking for when you're interviewing advisors that you think can help further the arc of the story that you're writing?
Yeah. I really appreciate this question, John, because one of my goals and my team's goals is to bring more and more industry voices onto both of our platforms. We think that Investment Executive and Advisor.ca are better when they feature the voices of advisors and other professionals in the industry. So we welcome your input. We're about to head into a redesign of investmentexecutive.com. And what you're going to see in that redesign is a whole section dedicated to opinion. And we want that opinion section to be as robust and conversational as it can possibly be. So, first message is really clear. You're welcome to pitch us. We would love to hear from you. That can be a letter to the editor, that can be an opinion piece, that can be a regular column if you have a solid idea for something on either platform. I think it's very important when you're pitching ideas or offering suggestions that they in no way be self serving. This is the mistake that everybody makes when talking to the media. They have a message that they want to communicate, whether that's commercial in its orientation or it just happens to be what they want to talk about. And that's what drives the conversation. I think to be a really successful partner of a media organization or contributor to a platform is to think about what the reader's informational needs are. And once you have a solid sense of that, then you find ways to deliver the message that you want to deliver in that context. So the thing I would say is don't pitch me stories. Call and ask me what I need. What do I think advisors want to know about? Tell me what you think advisors want to know about. I'd love to have that conversation with you. And let's work together to identify ways that you can provide value in that dialogue that continues on day after day between ourselves and Canadian financial advisors. More voices is better, always. Just the article pitch that's based on what product you have to sell this week is just never a good idea.
I enjoy hearing that because I think uh, I've always been a proponent of having multiple voices and having a robust discussion in dialogue and sometimes even a debate if it comes to that with regard to competing viewpoints in ways of doing things. We're getting to the point where we have to wrap up, Kevin. So I have to ask you my one last question that I ask everyone, and that is this is a podcast called Make Better Wealth Decisions. So, what advice would you give to the listeners and viewers today to help them make better wealth decisions?
Well, I'll tell you personally, it's a very simple answer for me. The best thing I ever did was to take the securities course. The Canadian securities course set me up for success in a way that nothing else I've ever done has for me. It was a great experience. I was so impressed with the program and learned a ton. So, shout out to the Canadian Securities Institute for that. I would say too, though, that there is a tendency, and I hear this more and more from people, to avoid the news. And I get it. It's a stressful time. What journalists do, however, is incredibly important. And I always tell people when they ask me about financial news in particular, is that it's periods like this where you learn the most. Reading the Globe and Mail or Investment Executive or whatever it is you choose to invest in is really going to provide you with a wider, deeper perspective that will inform decision making for the rest of your life. Just as we saw in 2008 and 9 following the credit crisis. The lessons I learned as a consumer of news and at the time as someone who was blogging for Canadian consumers still inform my understanding of markets and what can happen under a specific set of circumstances. So I would say very much as it gets more difficult, but encourage your clients, family, friends, whomever you're talking with, to really take full advantage of the financial media during periods of volatility. They add tremendous value.
Kevin, thank you so much for your time today. It's been really enjoyable, and I want to wish you all the success in your future endeavors.
Thank you, John. Big, big fan. Appreciate what you do.
This podcast is not to be construed as offering specific investment advice. Please consult a qualified advisor before acting. My books, Stand Up to the Financial Services Industry and Bullshift, are available online. If you'd like to meet to discuss how the topics in this podcast affect you directly, please visit my website.